It began not with the explosion of bombs or the scream of dive bombers, but with hesitation, a pause measured in minutes that decided the fate of an ocean. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, surrounded by the smell of aviation fuel and hot steel, scanning the horizon that should have promised victory. Japan's carrier strike force, Kido Butai, had dominated every battle it touched: Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, the Dutch East Indies. The Pacific had bent before it. Yet at Midway, that supremacy began to dissolve in the quiet moments between decisions. The paradox was brutal. A fleet built for speed, precision, and overwhelming first strikes was about to be destroyed by its own perfectionism. Hours earlier, Nagumo had believed he held the advantage. His reconnaissance planes had reported only a single enemy carrier. The plan was simple: lure the remaining American forces into an ambush, crush their airfields, and eliminate the last resistance to Japan's Pacific Empire. Midway was not meant to be a gamble. It was meant to be a demonstration of inevitability. But the U.S. Navy had read his intentions through intercepted Japanese codes. What Nagumo thought was a trap had already been turned inside out. Still, the Admiral could not know that. His pilots returned from their first strike on Midway Island, reporting partial success. The airfields were damaged, but not destroyed. American anti-aircraft fire had been fierce. Some of his planes needed refueling. Others required rearming for a second attack. He had only a fraction of his air group ready to strike again. And then came the report that changed everything. A U.S. carrier force had been sighted to the northeast. The moment demanded clarity. But Nagumo's command system was a masterpiece of hierarchy and ritual. Every decision filtered through layers of officers, reports, and radio silence. What he needed was instinct. What he had was procedure. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried their power in their hangars. Rows of bomb-laden aircraft stacked beneath wooden flight decks, fuel lines stretching like veins through the ship's heart. Rearming them was an art form and a time bomb. Each conversion from land attack to anti-ship ordnance required teams of armorers to unbolt 250-kilogram bombs, roll them across the hangar, and attach armor-piercing torpedoes instead. Fuel hoses snaked between aircraft, dripping vapor that hung in the humid air. It was a ballet of efficiency, but also vulnerability. Every minute of indecision meant more men exposed to disaster. Nagumo's dilemma was clear: launch immediately with half-armed planes or wait to rearm fully for a decisive strike. He chose to wait. The carrier's decks became a theater of controlled chaos, pilots pacing, armorers sweating, and officers watching the clock. Reports continued to arrive, conflicting, incomplete, sometimes hours old. American aircraft were incoming, but from where? Were they dive bombers, torpedo planes, or a decoy? No one knew. By 10:20 a.m., the decision to strike had finally been made. Planes were being rolled onto the deck. Engines began to whine, and the smell of gasoline thickened. On another morning, this would have been the prelude to another Japanese triumph. But at that precise moment, high above the clouds, 3 squadrons of U.S. Navy SPD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown broke through the overcast. Their timing was accidental, guided less by flawless intelligence than by luck, endurance, and the desperate heroism of American torpedo pilots who had drawn Japanese defenses away at sea level minutes earlier. The next 5 minutes would rewrite naval history. From Nagumo's bridge there was no warning. Only the sudden, distant wail of sirens and the appearance of silver-winged shapes falling vertically from the clouds. Bombs screamed downward, slicing through the humid air, and found their targets almost instantly. On Kaga, one bomb detonated near the bridge, igniting fueled planes waiting to take off. Another tore through the hangar deck, igniting ammunition. Within seconds, the carrier became a furnace. Akagi followed. One bomb, a single hit, struck near the aft elevator and triggered a chain reaction of explosions. Soryu burned next. Within 10 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers, the same ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were engulfed in flames. The precision and discipline that had made Kido Butai unstoppable now trapped it inside its own machinery. On the sea below, sailors dove into oil-slicked water to escape the inferno, their bodies illuminated by the burning decks above. For those on the bridge of Akagi, the noise was overwhelming, the sound of cracking steel and collapsing bulkheads. And for Nagumo, the realization came not as shock, but as silence. The battle was already lost. The planes that could have counterattacked were still being refueled and rearmed in their hangars, turned into coffins by the explosions he had tried to prevent. Historians later debated whether Nagumo's hesitation was a failure of will or of doctrine. In truth, it was both. Japanese carrier strategy had been built on the assumption that the enemy would react predictably, that speed and coordination could overcome uncertainty. But Midway exposed the fatal flaw: flexibility. The U.S. carriers, though battered and inexperienced, could adapt on the fly. Their decentralized command allowed improvisation. Nagumo's command punished it. When seconds mattered, procedure became paralysis. As smoke rose over the Pacific, the magnitude of the loss was not yet visible. Japan still had Hiryu afloat, and some of her planes would soon strike back at Yorktown. But the rhythm of the war had changed. The carrier fleet that had once symbolized Japan's unstoppable advance was gone, and its commander was left staring into the sea, trying to understand how a series of perfect calculations had led to catastrophe. The paradox remained. How could a man trained for precision and discipline lose everything to chance and hesitation? The answer lay not only in Nagumo's command, but in the very design and doctrine of Japan's carrier system, a structure that demanded perfection until the moment it needed intuition. The ocean around Midway had turned into a graveyard of steel and fire. From a distance, the sky shimmered with black columns of smoke rising from Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu. Each was a floating pyre, carrying hundreds of men and the weight of an empire's illusion. Aboard the lone surviving carrier Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi watched the horizon with a quiet fury. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been destroyed in less than 10 minutes. And yet, somewhere in the haze of disbelief, a desire for redemption took form. If Hiryu could strike back, even once, it might restore a fragment of honor to what had become a catastrophe. Nagumo, still aboard the crippled Akagi, was effectively cut off. Communications flickered in and out. Reports were garbled, filled with contradictions. Some claimed multiple American carriers. Others said one had been sunk. The fog of war had never been so literal and so blinding. The precision that had once defined the Kido Butai's operations was gone. What remained was instinct, anger, and the sound of burning fuel echoing across the sea. By noon, Yamaguchi had assumed operational command. Hiryu launched 2 counterstrikes in rapid succession, first against what was believed to be the carrier Yorktown. The Japanese pilots found her by luck and hit her twice, one bomb through the flight deck, another near the boilers. For a moment, the Japanese radios burst with celebration. Reports claimed Yorktown was sinking. Yamaguchi's men had done what seemed impossible. They had drawn blood from the Americans in the midst of total disaster. But like so much of Midway, appearances deceived. The Yorktown crew's damage control teams fought with remarkable speed and discipline. Within an hour, fires were contained, power was restored, and aircraft were being recovered again. The Americans had learned from the early Pacific defeats, from Coral Sea and from the Philippines, that survival in carrier warfare depended not only on aggression, but on damage control, training, and coordination. The U.S. Navy's ships had been built with redundant systems, fire suppression, and thicker armor.
ジャパニーズキャリアーズ、in contrast は、デザインスピードとストライキングパワー。They sacrificed resilience for offense. When flames reached their hangars, they became coffins. Japanese pilots who returned from their strike on Yorktown brought back incomplete intelligence. Many believed they had sunk her. Others, flying low over the sea, noticed she was still afloat but trailing smoke. Yamaguchi, interpreting these conflicting accounts, ordered a second strike, determined to finish the job. Hiryu's flight deck became the final stage of Japan's naval air power. Mechanics hurried to refuel and rearm planes as the deck crews shouted through the roar of engines. Every man knew that this could be their last mission. At 2:45 p.m., Hiryu's second wave launched. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of exhaust. They found Yorktown again, or rather, they thought they did.
In reality, they attacked Enterprise, mistaking it for their earlier target. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown after all, crippling her engines and listing her to port. For a brief moment, it seemed Japan had answered back, a final act of defiance from a wounded fleet. But as the Japanese strike force turned home, their own coordinates betrayed them. American scouts had located Hiryu's position. At 4 p.m., the U.S. carriers Enterprise and Yorktown, still afloat despite her damage, launched a combined counterstrike. 37 dauntless dive bombers, guided by the lessons of the morning's chaos, approached Hiryu from the northwest. Yamaguchi's lookouts spotted them too late. The carrier turned hard to port, its rudder foaming white water, but the bombers had already begun their dives. The first bomb struck near the forward elevator, rupturing the hangar deck. The second exploded near the midsection, igniting planes being refueled for a third attack. The third and fourth detonated near the stern, tearing open the ship's heart. Within minutes, Hiryu was ablaze. The smoke was so thick that crewmen below decks suffocated before flames reached them. Yamaguchi, refusing to abandon ship, ordered his men to save themselves. He stayed behind with Captain Tomeo Kaku, choosing to die with his carrier. Witnesses later described him standing calmly on the bridge, watching the horizon turn red. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers, the same ones that had struck Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, were either destroyed or burning beyond recovery. Over 300 aircraft were lost. More than 3,000 sailors perished. In contrast, the Americans had lost only 1 carrier and fewer than half as many men. The scale of the disaster was so immense that even Emperor Hirohito would not be informed of its full extent until weeks later. The Imperial Japanese Navy's core striking arm, built over 2 decades of industrial effort, had been erased in a single day. And yet, the most haunting part of the story was not the loss itself, but the blindness that preceded it. Nagumo's hesitation had not been cowardice. It was discipline, the very quality that had defined Japanese naval culture. He had followed procedure, waited for confirmation, and obeyed the doctrine that had brought Japan victory after victory. But modern war had changed faster than the system that commanded it. The Americans had learned to act with partial information, to trust initiative, to strike first and clarify later. Nagumo's fleet, by contrast, had been paralyzed by its own need for certainty. The men who survived described the final hours in almost biblical imagery. The sea filled with burning oil, the sky raining ash, the silence afterwards stretching into eternity. Some clung to wreckage. Others drifted for hours before being rescued. Many of them believed the gods had turned against them. In reality, it was not divine wrath, but human error, amplified by design flaws and rigid command that had doomed them. By nightfall, Nagumo transferred to the cruiser Nagara. His face, witnesses said, was expressionless, as though carved in stone. He had once been the architect of Japan's offensive power. Now he commanded only retreat. The radio signals sent to Tokyo were brief, factual, stripped of emotion. But between the lines was a truth he could not write, that the age of the Japanese carrier fleet was over. What Nagumo did not yet realize, and what the Japanese high command refused to admit, was that the loss of those 4 carriers was not just a tactical defeat. It was the destruction of Japan's ability to project air power. Without trained air crews, without replacement carriers, and without the industrial capacity to rebuild at American speed, the Empire of Japan had passed its turning point. The Pacific would never again belong to them. The roots of Japan's defeat at Midway were not born that morning in June. They had been growing for decades beneath the surface of the Imperial Navy's culture. To understand Nagumo's hesitation, one must look beyond the battle, into the psychology of the organization that produced him. Japan's naval command was forged in an age when precision, honor, and obedience were considered the ultimate virtues. It was a system that rewarded discipline, but punished initiative. In that structure, Nagumo was the perfect officer, exact, cautious, loyal to hierarchy. And that was precisely the problem. From the beginning of Japan's naval expansion, its doctrine was shaped by the shadow of the British Royal Navy. Officers were taught that victory came from rigid coordination and flawless execution, every ship a cog in a perfect machine. The Japanese Navy excelled at this in the 1930s, combining engineering brilliance with a near-spiritual devotion to procedure. When the carrier fleet rose to prominence, it adopted that same mindset. Each attack was planned to the minute. Each plane's payload was dictated in advance. Each signal had a specific form, tone, and timing. The Kido Butai had become the most formidable naval weapon in the world, not by improvisation, but by choreography. But war in the Pacific was not a stage for choreographed perfection. It was a vast, chaotic, and information-starved theater, one where flexibility mattered more than elegance. The U.S. Navy's doctrine evolved under these conditions. American commanders, many of them veterans of interwar exercises, had learned to decentralize authority. Pilots could act on instinct, squadron leaders could change targets mid-flight, and carrier captains could adapt without waiting for explicit orders. The contrast was striking. The Japanese sought flawless execution. The Americans sought fast adaptation. This difference, invisible in peacetime, became lethal in battle. When American aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, it was Japan's coordination that triumphed, a meticulously rehearsed strike that achieved total surprise. But Pearl Harbor's success concealed a fatal lesson, that a perfect plan could also create blind spots. Japanese intelligence underestimated how quickly the U.S. could recover, how rapidly it could mobilize industry. 6 months later, American factories were already outproducing Japan tenfold in aircraft and ships. Each lost plane or carrier for Japan was irreplaceable. For the U.S., it was a setback measured in weeks. By early 1942, the strain was already visible. Japan's carrier air crews were the most experienced in the world, but they were irreplaceable. Training a naval pilot took 3 to 4 years. The Americans shortened theirs to 8 months, accepting lower skill for greater numbers. Japan's naval leadership saw this as recklessness. In reality, it was adaptation. The Americans had realized that in modern mechanized war, production mattered more than perfection, a truth Japan was unwilling to face. The mechanical design of Japan's carriers reflected this philosophy. Their hangars were built as open spaces without armored decks, maximizing storage for aircraft and fuel. The result was devastating vulnerability. A single hit could ignite a chain reaction through fuel lines and ammunition stores. Meanwhile, American carriers like the Enterprise and Yorktown had armored flight decks, advanced fire suppression systems, and compartmentalized hangars. These differences were not trivial. They determined who lived and who burned. The Japanese prioritized offensive reach. The Americans prioritized endurance.
Nagumo himself was a reluctant believer in carrier warfare. Trained as a torpedo specialist, he had spent most of his career commanding cruisers and destroyers. When chosen to lead the Kido Butai, he was seen as a conservative, a man who could execute existing plans but not question them. His subordinates, many younger and more innovative, were rarely encouraged to challenge his orders. The Japanese Navy's rigid chain of command meant that critical information often moved too slowly to be useful. At Midway, this was fatal. Reconnaissance reports were delayed, decoded, and relayed in sequence, losing precious minutes. When Nagumo finally acted, it was on outdated intelligence. The irony is that Japan had the technology and talent to win the opening phases of the war, and did. But it was undone by the very principles that had once made it strong. The obsession with flawless execution, the mistrust of deviation, the cult of obedience, all became shackles in a war that demanded speed and creativity. Meanwhile, the Americans were learning faster. Their early defeats at Wake Island, the Philippines, and the Coral Sea became laboratories for improvement. They studied damage reports, changed aircraft tactics, adjusted carrier spacing, and refined radar coordination. They began to integrate lessons from field failures into every new doctrine. In short, they turned loss into momentum. Japan, by contrast, turned victory into complacency. Midway revealed that imbalance in its purest form. When the first wave of American dive bombers struck, the Japanese ships were caught in the middle of a rearmament cycle. Their decks loaded with fuel and explosives, their aircraft halfway prepared for a different mission. That vulnerability was not accidental, it was systemic. The Japanese had planned for perfection, not disruption. They believed that their own plan would unfold cleanly, that the enemy would never arrive at the wrong time. But the enemy did. In the aftermath, internal reports within the Japanese Navy avoided assigning blame. Officially, the disaster was described as a misfortune of timing. But privately, officers like Admiral Mugaki and Captain Fuchida understood the truth. The loss at Midway was not bad luck. It was a failure of adaptability, a system collapsing under the weight of its own ideology. In Tokyo, senior admirals debated how to spin the defeat. Publicly, they claimed the Americans had suffered heavier losses, but inside the naval general staff, the realization spread like a quiet sickness. The empire's naval supremacy had been shattered in a single afternoon. The Kido Butai, the core of Japan's offensive doctrine, could never be rebuilt. The shipyards simply could not keep pace with American industry. Still, many refused to accept it. Even after Midway, Japan pressed on with operations in the Solomons and Guadalcanal, hoping to regain initiative through bravery and sacrifice. But courage could not substitute for carriers. The pilots lost at Midway represented not just lives, but years of experience and training, a currency Japan could no longer afford. As Nagumo returned to Tokyo weeks later, survivors saluted him in silence. There were no accusations, no open disgrace, only the heavy knowledge that everything had changed. His eyes, one officer recalled, seemed to look beyond people, as if searching for something that could not be found. The seeds of Japan's defeat had finally borne fruit. And yet, the lessons of Midway would echo far beyond that war, a warning written not just in fire, but in doctrine. In the years after Midway, the silence surrounding Admiral Nagumo grew heavier than the defeat itself. He had not been court-martialed nor stripped of command. Japan's high command needed a scapegoat, but it also needed to protect the illusion that its system remained unbroken. Nagumo, ever dutiful, accepted the burden in silence. He continued to serve, commanding carrier groups during the Guadalcanal campaign, then later leading forces defending the Marianas, but the spark of confidence was gone. His decisions became cautious, defensive, marked by an awareness that the empire's momentum had already turned against it. What had been an empire of initiative now moved only in reaction. Historians often call Midway the turning point of the Pacific War,
But that phrase understates its psychological impact. Japan's aura of invincibility, built on the myth of Pearl Harbor's perfection, was shattered. The same doctrine that had glorified obedience now left its leaders paralyzed. Every decision was haunted by the ghost of Midway, by the image of burning carriers, by the realization that the Empire's strategic genius had not been defeated by superior firepower, but by faster thinking. In Tokyo, military theorists dissected the loss in secret memoranda. They studied how the Americans had coordinated carrier groups, how radar had guided attacks, and how damage control crews had saved ships that, by Japanese standards, should have been doomed. The findings were damning. Japan's naval air doctrine had overemphasized offense and underinvested in resilience. Its communication systems lacked redundancy. Its aircraft were powerful but fragile. Their pilots unmatched in skill, but exhausted and irreplaceable. The Empire's war machine had been engineered for victory, not endurance. American intelligence analysts, meanwhile, studied the same battle through captured records and survivor testimonies. They saw a mirror of their own vulnerabilities. In the months after Midway, the U.S. Navy conducted exhaustive simulations to understand why luck had played such a decisive role, and how to remove luck from future battles. The answer was structure, better communication, broader command flexibility, and standardized training that empowered initiative at every level. These principles would form the foundation of modern naval doctrine, still studied in war colleges today. Midway became more than a battle. It became a case study in the psychology of command. What happens when a system built for control faces a world that demands adaptation? Nagumo's paralysis was not personal weakness. It was systemic inevitability. His mind was trained to wait for perfect information, to strike only when the plan was complete. But modern warfare punished hesitation. The enemy that acted first, even imperfectly, often won. Decades later, strategists would find echoes of Nagumo's dilemma across military history. The same flaw resurfaced in tank warfare, where overly complex weapons like the German Tiger II failed in the field due to logistical rigidity. It appeared again in the Cold War, where nations built weapons so intricate that they became too fragile to use effectively, the very definition of forgotten weapons. Even the later development of machine guns, such as the M60 and M240, reflected lessons from that era. Reliability, adaptability, and ease of maintenance mattered more than elegance or theoretical superiority. War punishes complexity that cannot endure pressure. Nagumo's tragedy lies in this universality. His failure was not uniquely Japanese, it was human. The need for certainty, the fear of being wrong, the paralysis that comes when every option carries ruin. In that sense, Midway was a mirror held up to all future commanders. It exposed the limits of technology when divorced from judgment and the futility of hierarchy when it suppresses intuition. As the war dragged on, Nagumo's name faded into obscurity. By 1944, he commanded the defense of the Marianas from Saipan, a hopeless task. American carrier groups now roamed freely, launching airstrikes at will. Japan's few remaining pilots were undertrained and outnumbered. On June 29, 1944, as U.S. forces advanced inland, Nagumo realized there was nothing left to command. That night, he took his own life in his command bunker. His last recorded words were simple: "I have done my duty." There was no bitterness, no justification, only the silence of a man who had once commanded an empire and now understood its end. After the war, American investigators found Nagumo's name barely mentioned in post-war Japanese reports. His subordinates had honored him quietly, acknowledging his discipline and integrity, but few spoke of his leadership. In the collective memory of Japan, he became a ghost, a man whose failure was too costly to discuss, but too significant to forget. Yet historians who returned to the records began to see something deeper. Nagumo was not a villain of incompetence, but a symbol of transition, the moment when the old world of naval warfare gave way to the new. Before Midway, victory was a matter of coordination and courage. After Midway, it was a matter of communication, intelligence, and speed. The modern military, with its integrated radar networks, autonomous systems, and data-driven command centers, traces its DNA to that shift. Midway was the battle where information became the decisive weapon. In the decades that followed, war colleges from Annapolis to Tokyo studied the transcripts of Nagumo's decisions, the timing of his orders, and the structure of his communication chain. They found that every modern failure, from Vietnam's rigid command hierarchies to the misjudgments of armored doctrine in Iraq, carried the same echo. Systems designed for perfection crumble when the situation demands improvisation. From modern officers, Midway remains a warning written in fire. It reminds them that the enemy is not only the one across the sea, but the one within. The fear of acting without certainty, the temptation to delay in pursuit of the perfect plan. Nagumo's hesitation cost Japan its empire, but it also taught the world that no machine, no doctrine, and no hierarchy can replace the human ability to decide in chaos. Today, the wrecks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rest deep beneath the Pacific, silent monuments to that truth. Their twisted decks, once the pride of Japan's navy, are now overgrown with coral and life. In that stillness lies the ultimate paradox of war, destruction giving way to renewal, silence carrying the memory of decisions made and unmade. If there is a lesson left from Admiral Nagumo's fate, it is that even the most powerful systems collapse when they forget the fragility of time. In war, hesitation is not measured in hours, it is measured in seconds. And sometimes, as Midway proved, those seconds are enough to decide the future of the world.